Good morning. The music today, again, was from a CD called The Civil War Ballroom. And these were a couple of pieces from the 1840s and the 1850s, the Cali Polka, Lancer's Quadrille, and the Sans Souci Gallop. Again, the dances were beginning now to speed up, and they tended to become much more intimate. The immigrants were involved. It began to excite often bourgeois middle-class anxieties about respectability, and that will continue through the rest of the century. There's a very famous book that was published at the end of the 19th century that was describing what was going on, and the title was From the Ballroom to Hell. So it gives you a sense of what they were thinking about. Exam next week at this time. Some people have asked questions about the kinds of choices that you will have. There will be, as I've said, again, the first third will be short answer. There will be one short answer identification that will be worth 5 points, for which there will be no choice. Then there will be 7 short answers for which there will be some choice, 7 out of 9 or 10. So you don't have to know everything, but you'll have to know those. And in each case, you'll be asked to identify the event or the significance in New York City's history. Then there'll be the exam, and the exam will have some choice in part of it. There will be 2 essay questions. One will be assigned, and there will be no choice, and the other will give you a choice between 2 questions. So it's a crapshoot. You can decide how many to study for, but there will be no way to. But I can't assure you that there will be any question that will not be asked. Okay. So in other words, the first of the 2 essay questions we will choose. The second, there will be a choice between 2. Okay. The walking tour, for those who wish to join me on Saturday in the sunshine and the warmth. It's supposed to be close to 50. Should be a glorious day. And we'll be done by noon, though there are also nice places to eat in that area. On the syllabus, I note that we'll be meeting at 10 a.m. in front of the Borough Hall. Okay? That will be in the building. It will be the front of the building in which you will be facing Manhattan. Okay? Half the building faces away from Manhattan. The front of the building actually faces Manhattan, and we'll meet in front of that part of the building. And as it said here, you can take subways A, C, or F to J Street, Borough Hall, the 2, 3, 4, 5 to Borough Hall, or the M or R to Court Street. And in all of those subways, there are usually maps that show you where you are, and you can walk or pull out your GPS on your phone and walk, but it's all of a block away in most cases. And a couple of the stops actually are right in front of Borough Hall. Okay? And so we'll begin around 10 a.m. from that location. And you are welcome within limitations to if you have a visiting friend from out of town who wants to join you, or a roommate who's passionate. We're usually in the numbers of anywhere from 10 to 20, so we can usually handle a guest or 2 if that's the case. So you should feel free to invite guests if you wish to. Any questions about any of that? Fragment 6, Game 2, meant to be the easy one. Okay, pretty straightforward. This game ends today, so you hand them in on Monday, and the prize. Last time there were 8 people who all got grade boosts from it. So, but one prize winner whose answers were thought to be, and whose additional 2 fragments were thought to be the best examples. So you're expected to hand in identifications of the 6 fragments and 2 fragments of your own. And again, I suggest they be fragments, not whole buildings, as you think about it, okay? Or ideas. That's number 6. This was number 5, we didn't talk about last time. Okay? Some of you will find, especially if you should see it if you're a Tisch student. Number 4, I'm told that since I took this photo, the air conditioners have been removed for the winter. Small little park, as it were, or greenery. That's actually a view through a gate, as a hint to you. Pooh Bear? Got to know your Dylan song. Number one, I'm guessing it's not clear that you will get all 6, and that will be all right. You'll do the best you can. This is the hardest one. And as I said, it really requires a bit of research often to find out who Mittelstadt was and where that location. The location's not so hard to find. Again, I think I suggested to you, I took this from the window of my office last year. So if you know where my office was last year, or want to do a little research to figure that out, where SCA was last year, you'll find out where you would be able to see that. Not so hard. Not sure where those all disappeared to. Okay. Sorry, last time the video took us really to very much the end of the class. I don't know if there are any questions that any of you had from that you wanted to raise. The material that the video opened with, the text, is actually the transcript of a text from the person who was the head of the 5 Points Refuge. And I think that it was made clear in the text, but some of you may have missed that. So these were mostly documentary materials. The family was a family that actually existed. However, it's impossible to know the details of their lives, so they took the family from census materials and from city directories, reconstructed that family, and then try to give you a sense of what typified the experience of a family living in 5 Points, and the kind of so what they were trying to do was open the video with a sense of the perspectives of the people we would have called visitors to the poor, and then secondly, the perspective of the people who were being visited upon, or the residents, to give you 2 senses of how they understood the events, the riots that were occurring in '57 around temperance, among other things. Okay? All right, as a lead up to the draft riots, which will be the subject of the last lecture before your midterm, I want to talk today about the history of African Americans in antebellum New York City. This was a story that we began properly in New Netherlands, as you all will recall. As early as 1626, you'll remember that the West Indies Company brought over a cargo of 11 Africans to New York, and that was the beginning of the African American settlement in New York City. The first half of the 17th century then was dominated by the role of the West Indies Company as a slave trading company. So it was engaged in bringing over Africans to New York as part of a slave labor force. By 1644, close to 7,000 African captives have been brought from the African coast, particularly from Angola. They don't all settle in New York. They're brought over on slave traders from New York and then scattered among the colonies. Okay? But as we've tried to suggest earlier, the New York City economy in the 18th century becomes increasingly and always centrally dependent on slave labor. Okay? Not because we're necessarily using it as part of our own labor force, though indeed we do, but also because our merchants and our traders, our finance, are all integrally connected with the emergence of that economy, north and south. And then to the extent to which it's involved in cotton production, it will be tied to the global economy with the British Isles as well. By the 18th century, however, New York City had the largest colonial slave population north of Maryland. Okay? And in fact, was second in all the colonies, only to Charleston. So while we have a tendency here in the North to think through our experience of the American Civil War of slavery as a Southern experience in which New Yorkers, among others, were leading the fight to free the slaves against the legacy of a slave economy in the South, it's worth noting that through much of the colonial history of New York City, we are as intricately connected with a slave economy as any place, and indeed more so than every place else, in terms of both sheer numbers and in percent of population. In 1698, it's estimated there were about 2,000 slaves in New York City. By 1746, again by mid-century, that number is 9,000. And only 8 years later, it's up to 13,000 slaves. So very quickly you see there's an importation and growing dependence on slave trade. And you ought to know that during much of this period, people who are not involved as slaves are often white folks who are indentured servants. It may be estimated that as much as a third of the non-African American population are indentured servants. So if we talk about an economy that is embedded in servitude, we're talking about the majority of the New York City population is engaged in service and servitude for much of that period. Indeed, it's estimated that black slaves in the first half of the 18th century constitute about a third of the immigration to New York City through the port of New York. Lots more are coming, but they're not necessarily coming just directly through the port, because if they came through the port, they had to pay, someone would have to pay a tax on them because they are property. Now you remember that taxes were collected unevenly, and a lot of people escaped taxes, but one way to escape them best was not bring them through that port at all, so they brought them through illegal commerce through Long Island. So you would use ports along New York, along the Long Island harbor, in order to also bring in slave labor. So while 35% or so is simply the immigration through New York ports, it's important to realize that's not the entire slave population even that's being brought through the port, through New York City. Okay? More are passing through from the island. The increase of slavery and the dependence on slavery in the New York economy upset some people because they worried about slaves' discontent. We've seen that in the earlier history. Remember, we talked about the riots that at least were seen to accompany what were thought to be suspicious fires, remember, in 1712 and 1741, just as examples of all of that. There were efforts as a consequence often to alleviate some of the conditions of slaves, but on the whole, the trajectory of slavery, of enslavement of blacks in New York City, from the beginning in the 17th century, the mid-1600s, to the late 18th century, is one of increased restriction, not one of growing freedom. The conditions of slavery become worse in New York during this period, not better. It opens better. If you remember, as early as 1646, we talked about the idea of half freedom. Remember, after that terrible war, Keith's War, remember that bloody battle against the Native Americans in this area? A measure of freedom, this kind of anomaly, half freedom, like being half pregnant, right? Half freedom was given out to some slaves. It lasted, it didn't extend often to their children, and it gave them a promise, basically, of some independence as long as they worked on company projects. It created a form of indentured service for some African Americans in the middle of the 17th century. And indeed, if you were born to a white parent, a white mother in particular, because there was a form of matrilineal freedom that was given, white mothers' children of black fathers, mixed race people, were often given more freedom in the middle of the 17th century than they were given later. They were initially, in other words, believed to have been whitewashed, as it were, in the earlier period. But in the later period, as their numbers increase, having a drop of black blood made you black rather than white. So there is a blackening of that population and a degrading of it in terms of white attitudes in the 18th century, with increased restrictions on them. Okay? And that becomes clear as early as 1682, when their rules limiting their assembly are passed. You're not allowed to have more than 4 slaves at any one time assembling in any one place. Already suggests people's concern about insurrection, conspiracy. So there are now restrictions beginning to develop, and that's one marker of those. And it needs to be understood that even while we're talking about that only as a formal marker, informal practices were restrictive and racialized, biased. That's to say, you can pass a law saying people should be treated equally and fairly, but that doesn't change people's attitudes. And people's attitudes, much as they had been toward Native Americans, were quite biased against blacks. And so any black, even someone who was free, was always suspect and could easily be enslaved if someone claimed they were their owner. That's to say, notions of innocence or guilt always fell on the side of the whites against blacks. And that remained even when laws were not in place. They remained, in other words, in the culture and cultural practice. The war for independence, you remember as an example, even by 1702, we talked about the creation, remember, of the city whipper. Again, an example of increased restrictions and fears that take place. So there's a formal government position in the city of New York of the city of the whipper. Again, that was meant not for white labor, it was meant for black slaves to create discipline. The war for independence in the middle of the 18th century begins to quicken claims for freedom because of the rhetoric about freedom could easily be extrapolated to be talking about freedom against wicked King George to freedom for everyone, especially given some of the pamphleteering from people like Tom Paine and others, the rights of man, proclaiming the rights of man. Indeed, the British governor, remember we were a Tory state, freed slaves who were willing to fight for the Tories. Okay? So one impetus for the freeing of slaves, again, was to make them part of the military. And that takes place, and free blacks begin to move into the city, and they increase in their numbers in the 1770s and 1780s. That didn't mean, however, that they moved into the mansions of the wealthy. They lived in makeshift tents. They always lived in the worst conditions. So we're talking about political freedom, but it was not accompanied by increased social opportunity necessarily. That was shaped still by attitudes about prejudice and discrimination. So we need to remember that political change does not always translate into immediate social change for people. Not a one-to-one relationship between those two. So indeed, they are freer, they free to fight in the army, but they always could fear being abducted or being claimed as slaves or being put back into slave auctions because of their black skin if a white person said, this was a person you freed, but they are my personal property. And the claim that someone would make was enough, was served as to legitimate the re-enslavement. But as I've suggested, the ideals of the Revolution, the ideals of the Enlightenment, the language of rights and equality, led some people now for the first time, including white people, to lay the claims for abolition of slavery. And indeed, by the emergence of the period of independence, all northern states freed their slaves, with the exception of two states, New Jersey and New York. One might ask why and what distinguishes those two. And one distinguishing characteristic, of course, is these were the two states that were settled by the Dutch. It's a Dutch legacy of the English. The Dutch were the merchants, and it was an economy that was still deeply dependent on slavery in ways in which the other colonies were not. So in some ways, the other colonies, it was easier to free the slaves. They were less dependent on them for labor. Here there was a vested interest, always resisting the freedom of slaves because they were being told, frankly, to lose their personal property and their own wealth. Nonetheless, some major white leaders, political leaders, advocated for abolition of slavery. In 1777, John Jay, all of you know him quite well, drafted a law to abolish slavery. It failed. He could not win support. He raised it again in 1785. It failed. Couldn't get support. It did get the support, however, of two people that are worth noting, Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. And you may remember that when we talked about New York City in the period after the end of the war, before the development of the Constitution, that as Tory estates were being broken up, new people moved in, people of wealth who held many of the same attitudes as the Tories, and they were Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. These were the Federalists. And so one needs to have some sense is why is it that these basically deeply conservative people supporting large state government were also supporting abolition of slavery? And I think the key piece probably for this is to understand their commitment was to free trade, to free labor. It was a principle, in other words, that presumed that they should be free to be part of a labor force. Okay? That it wasn't an issue around, it wasn't so much a moral issue, the extent to which, with the exception of the extent to which labor or free labor was seen as a moral issue. By 1785, the state legislature in New York votes for gradual emancipation. But the rules don't take effect because they can't agree what that could possibly mean. What would it mean to be emancipated? They couldn't quite get their heads around the notion of what would it mean for blacks to get free. What rights should they have? It might seem self-evident to the rest of us, just the same rights as everybody else. But that wasn't self-evident in 1785 to people. Remember, this was the same moment, just to remind you about that the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York was asking to have a charter and was being told the Chamber of Commerce can have a charter. It had had one since the 60s, but if you have a charter, that's a conspiracy of combination, an illegal combination. It's a notion that, in fact, your right does not extend to the idea that you can work together as a group. Individualism was a right, but collective rights were seen as a conspiracy of trade. So already there were nuanced and conflicting understandings that were in their own way almost class-inflected about rights. And slavery and the notions about what to do about slaves play into all of those kinds of nuanced debates that we're having. Nonetheless, a group of people then decide, all right, we've got to go around the state. We've got to do something else. They form their own organization. In that same year, 1785, in New York, we have the Society for Promoting the Manumission of Slaves. It has a fancy title. It's not simply the Society for Promoting the Manumission of Slaves. It includes, and protecting such of them as have been or may be liberated. What does it mean to be manumitted? Anyone know? Yes. Pardon?
To work to buy your own freedom.
No. No.
Isn't it just freedom in your will? Like the slave owner puts a clause in the will freeing them.
All right, not in your own will. In the slave owner freed you in his will. So at his death, you were then made free. So that's what it meant to be manumitted. It's freedom that's extended in the will of a slave owner to the slave. Okay? So it was a way in which you could say, well, I'm going to get the benefits of you while I'm alive, but after I'm dead, I'll be moral. Maybe it was a way of making sure when you went through the pearly gates that somehow or another you were going to get a favorable reading, but it suggested that whatever moral qualms they had, this was a kind of halfway measure, manumission, that was being pressed. The leaders of all of that, of course, were John Jay, who founded the organization, and most of its leaders were the Quakers. Many of whom you may recall, the Quaker community was located out in Flushing, Queens, but elsewhere. So it had 31 members at its early meeting. We're not talking about all of New York City rushing to embrace this, but we have the beginnings of an abolitionist movement. The problem, of course, even for this abolitionist movement, as it would suggest, because it's about manumission, most of the members owned slaves themselves. So it wasn't as if they believed entirely that slaves should be free. They just believed they should be free when they die. Not when the slaves die, when the slave owners die. So it meant that even John Jay owned slaves. So here we have the leader of slave abolitionists as a slave owner. Okay? So these people's attitudes are pretty complicated, you can imagine. That's a fair way of saying hypocritical, I suppose. They propose, as a consequence, what is manumission? It's gradual emancipation. Okay? It's gradual emancipation. Their original proposition was that slaves would be free who were younger than 28, but they'd be free when they're 35. So if you were under 28, you'd eventually be free when you got to be 35 years old. It's a little like saying when you were old enough to vote. So they thought at 35 you might be mature enough, I'm guessing, to somehow be trusted with your freedom. Those who were between the ages of 28 and 38 would be freed in 7 years. And those over 45, who were probably thought to be like the rest of us who are over 45 in such terrible degenerate shape, we couldn't cause any trouble at all, so you could be freed immediately. So the old-timers were freed. And again, if you remember what life expectancies were like then, what ages of people were like then, 45 was already a pretty old person. Not a terribly vigorous person, so they would be freed. At the same time, however, that provision for all of that gradual, I've spent all this time telling you about it. What I didn't tell you is that it's all voted down, not passed. Even that kind of gradual, which you would think not be terribly threatening, was not supported. So there is a lot of fundamental opposition, and that remains in place for a long time. It needs to be talked about. In 1785, instead, laws are passed, but the laws that are passed basically just prohibit the sale of slaves being imported into the state. So their way, the one provision people were willing to accept is we won't free anybody, but we won't allow the population to be increased by importing slaves only through the birth rate. Okay? So that was the sop, as it were, to the emancipators or to the abolitionists. In 1787, that organization forms the first the Manumission Society, or this Manumission Society creates the first New York City African free school. And it's worth noting, here we have in 1787 a free school for blacks. There is no public school for whites. Zero, zilch. But there is a free school for blacks, a public school for blacks. All the other schools are church-run, charity-run operations or higher education. It had 40 students very early. Many of them were children of slaves, and they had a one-room schoolhouse. And what kind of skills did they teach them? What kinds of things you thought they taught? They basically taught them how to become domestic servants. Okay? So they taught them things like needlework, housework, and how to become no longer slaves, but just servants. That's not terribly different, by the way, of what rehabilitation was thought like if you went to a prison or if you went to the workhouse. That's what you did with poor people. You basically presumed that what their best in their lot in life really equipped them best for those kind of menial tasks. It was presumed that the reason they were poor was because they weren't smart enough to be rich, so that what they did have, however, were physical skills that could allow them to dig ditches and do sewing and carry wood and maybe birth babies. By 1820, that schoolhouse grows, becomes a second schoolhouse, and it's not terribly well attended because most of the black kids don't have enough money even to have clothing to work. So there are real issues about even how widespread it becomes. But it is worth noting in 1820, when it is growing, we have for the first time a public school for whites created. And it's created by the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, and it's the school that they still operate on West 44th Street, called now the Mechanics Institute. So the first public school is created by working people because the city isn't willing to do it. The working people do it on their own. And it becomes the basis of the public school system. And because they feel they need to have something to read in that school, they create their own free library for their children at the first time in 1820. So the first public library and public school are created by these new working class organizations that had, I need to say, as I mentioned to you, plenty of wealthy supporters. So all the people who became mayors were members of the General Society as well. But they're providing it for working people, and it's the origins of the public school and public library system. While all this is happening, however, in 1799, a bill finally passes for gradual emancipation, and it is the cornerstone bill in changing the status of blacks in New York City. It's 1799. As of July 4th that year, all children of slaves would be free. Again, symbolic, July 4th, 99. A full recognition, that's to say, that it is tied to the language and meaning of the Declaration of Independence, of the idea of independence and freedom. They don't just choose August 15th. It's July 4th. The children of slaves will be free. Free to do what is the question, of course. They would be then subject to apprenticeship. They'd be free to go into the workforce as an apprentice to a master.
Do they have like a certain age limit on that, like under 7 years old? Or
I don't know, but I'm sure they did. I don't know what the age would have been. It usually would have been close to 12 or 13 years old. Okay? They would be required to serve, however, also the mother's owner for up to 28 years if you were men and 25 years if you were female. So what they were doing is they were giving you what we might call a kind of liminal freedom, a space for freedom, but it was also limited as well as liminal. Okay? So you were free, but you were expected to be in service to your masters for 28 years and 25 years if you were a woman. That's from 99, add 28 years. What does that become? What year? 1827. So it's not till 1827 all of those children are going to be free. And indeed, slavery is not effectively abolished in New York City until July 4th, 1827. People are enslaved in New York City. It's a slave state until July 4th, 1827. It is, in fact, the largest emancipation in the United States until 1861. Until 1861. And it occurs in New York City because of that law then. In the interim, there were other efforts, however, to free slaves, to create conditions of freedom. In 1816, in New York City, we have the development of the American Colonization Society. It's a compromise effort by philanthropists and clerical abolitionists, people from the church who were leading this struggle, to get slave owners to free blacks, and their answer was to send them out of the country entirely. So one effort at abolitionism is expulsion. It was to send them elsewhere. The leader of this movement is Henry Clay from the South, and effectively the objective is to send blacks eventually 200,000, they hope, of the 2 million then in the United States to Liberia. And starting in 1819, they do that. They start sending blacks to a African colony, back to the country where you came from kind of thing, attitude. Okay? So there is that kind of effort. It's not abolitionism as you see in its own way, though it is it's expulsion and therefore freedom in that way. Liberia, it should be noted, the state that they're sending them to in the 20s, they're about, in the 1820s, the data I have is about 2,500 African Americans actually migrate there. They go, however, they do not find utopia. They find, in fact, that the area is already settled by other people who think it's their land and weren't exactly thrilled to have these African Americans now coming and claiming that supposedly it's their homeland. And so they go to a place where they find themselves engaged in armed struggle. And armed struggle in which the advocates and leaders for them are white governors. So Liberia is led by white governors appointed by the Colonization Society until 1842. Liberia only declares its independence in 1847. The end of slavery, however, by 1827, increases anxieties about what blacks are going to do with their freedom. It doesn't remove fear, it intensifies fear. But it also adds a new dimension to the problem of race, and that is class. Because if they are free, they are now free to be an alternative and cheap labor force for competition with white labor already in the city. So what had earlier been seen and experienced as a race problem that excited fear, remember again the need for a whipper, the anxieties that provoke what happens in 1741 and elsewhere, now becomes animated as much by class fears. It extends, that's to say, to a much broader group of whites who are equally concerned that these people who are now free to take their jobs at cheap labor forces, at cheap labor. So there are now advocates for the end of slavery in the North and in the South. Or advocating it now in the South because it's already been now freed in the North, but are going to just excite further fears in the North that there'll be more free black labor to take their jobs. So the whole debate about slavery is transformed by, in some ways, by what's taking place in 27 through the early 30s. At the same moment that work is being transformed, people are becoming dependent wage laborers. Abolitionism is now growing, and now the excitement that abolitionism should be extend to the South means for New Yorkers the idea that that labor force in the South is also going to come and take their jobs. So anybody now seen as supporting abolition in the North is suspect of really just wanting to take away jobs from Irish Catholics, like the ones you saw in the film last time. Romanists, papists, alcoholics, degenerates, lazy folks, whores and whoremongers. That's the language in which abolitionism, the backdrop to which abolitionism against which it takes place. We talked about in the early 1830s, slaves are freed in the British West Indies, remember. We have Nat Turner's rebellion. We have all those evangelicals coming around and saying, if you want reform and freedom, we want it now, not yesterday, not tomorrow, now. Get up and do something about it if we're going to have a moral society. That could excite even more reformers and make other people anxious. And we have New Yorkers being outspoken in support of this abolitionist movement. Most notably, a couple of men and women we need to talk about. The most prominent and most interesting, I think, in many respects, is the one that's often least well known to New Yorkers, a woman by the name of Fanny Wright. Extraordinary woman, Scottish-born reformer, actually settles in New York in 1829, where she moves in and lives with Robert Owen. Now, my historian friends here will know who Robert Owen is, but I'm not sure all the rest of you will, but it's the basis of the word we call Owenism. He was a major mill manufacturer and son who gets involved really in the development of utopian communities. Remember, we talked about those, the Shakers, talked about the Oneida community. Well, the Owenite community was settled in New Harmony, was the title they gave it, in Indiana. And it was an effort to create a new harmonious set of social relations. Again, as an alternative to the ravages that he saw in these new dependent wage relations of this new creature called industrial capitalism. So you had this guy who actually had been a mill owner himself, now trying to create what we might now call cooperative industries, in which everything would be collectively owned by everybody doing the work. He comes from New Harmony to New York City with Fanny Wright. Back to Wright for a minute before we come to Owen. Her background: she was the daughter of a political radical who had read much of the work of Thomas Paine about the rights of man. Her parents had died, and she sailed for New York City as early as 1818. She lives in New York from 1818 to 1820, writes a play on the subject of Swiss independence, which is published in New York. She wins the friendship of the Marquis de Lafayette. As you remember, these kind of French Republicans who had been so involved in support of America in the 1770s and 80s, but now were thought to be occasionally a little suspect because their republicanism had become often too much in support of the rights of man, which could be seen by increasingly. Paine had also fallen into disfavor among more elites, because they were fearful that the rights of man might extend to working people who might get a little uppity about their notions about what those rights would mean. So her friendship with Lafayette was a little suspect to elite New York, but she visited France. She returns to New York City in 24 to join Lafayette's triumphal tour, visits Jefferson and Madison, where she's encouraged. And remember that Jefferson was always a pretty complicated person in relationship to slaves himself, as many of you know. But she's encouraged by them, slave owners, to pursue a plan that she had to purchase, educate, and emancipate slaves. So she creates this innovative plan, master plan, to free slaves called the Neshoba Plan. She publishes in 1825 a book called A Plan for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery in the United States without danger or loss to the citizens of the South. So she's evolving a plan that she thinks people like Jefferson and Madison are going to like, because it'll free the slaves, but it won't cost them anything. So how is she going to do that? She basically is going to form her own plantation. She gets a big tract of land in Tennessee, 640 acres near Memphis, which she calls Nashoba, Nashoba. And she purchases slaves. Okay? She raises money from the plantation and from other abolitionists, and she buys slaves. So the slave owners don't lose any money because their slaves have been purchased from them. And then she frees them on the plantation, with the promise that there'll be further freedom if the plantation makes a lot of money. They can buy more slaves and free more slaves. So the idea was to create a kind of free slave-freeing factory, a plantation where you're going to raise enough money to buy all the slaves and free them. Didn't work. Okay? Not very easy to raise all that kind of money. Complicated even more so by her radical philosophy, because it extended beyond simply freeing slaves. It meant freeing man, which in this case happened to mean women too. And she understood that the freedom of women, was often dependent on male patriarchy, on the ownership and dominance of women by men. And she believed that the enshrinement of that dependence came from marriage, in which women were effectively conferred all their rights to men. And that's what marriage did in the early part of the 19th century. When you were married, all your rights went to your husband. So she proposed, in fact, the end of those kinds of subordinations of women. In part, she encouraged it by suggesting that love should be free, not purchased, not for sale, and not involve ownership. But free love could easily become seen as scandalized in respectable New York, as you can imagine, and elsewhere. And so the Neshoba experiment becomes easily stigmatized by the broader set of radical social principles of freedom that she espouses and articulates. She gets sick in 1827 and returns to New York, but mostly because of the scandal over the charges of free love. They were not just charged, she believed in it. She moves to New Harmony with this socialist radical community, this Owenite community with Robert Dale Owen that I mentioned. She helps him edit a newspaper, and then together, that community also ultimately has intermittent success. In good part because too many people often like the idea of making more money than the next person, and they complain that the other person was lazier than they were. I'm working harder than them. Why should I make more money than the other person? These were very difficult ideas to... It was hard enough to create a plan, but often for a plan to be successful, you had to create a whole different mindset. And that wasn't easily transformed just by a plan on paper. So these utopian communities, as they were called, ultimately succeeded for 10 and 20 and 30 and 40 years, but often eventually collapsed. She moves to New York City with Owen. And in 1829, she helps Owen edit his radical newspaper called the Free Inquirer. She advocates for liberalized divorce laws, for birth control, for free secular public education. These are all radical ideas. The idea that there should be public education and it shouldn't be run by a church. How appalling, how immoral, how outrageous. Birth control, how outrageous. Today, it excites even more outrage. The whole nature of that debate changes, is transformed. But she was arguing for women having some voice about their bodies. That itself was extraordinary. The idea even that women, remember this was the moment of the cult of true womanhood. What should a proper woman do? Stay home in the hearth. Honor your husband. What she's saying, quite the opposite. She's getting out front in talking on behalf of women's rights. And it's in New York City. If you want to understand, in some sense, the origins of Greenwich Village, the origins of that part of New York City's history, which is also as a beacon for idiosyncratic ideas, for unpopular ideas, for ideas that elsewhere in the country aren't given voice, we see it in someone like Fanny Wright and in New York City with these kinds of ideas. So she's arguing again, as I suggested, public education, and finally for the political organizing of the working classes, who didn't need a lot of help. Remember, they'd already formed the Workies, the Working Men's Parties, and in a couple of years they were going to do just that in their own citywide trade union federation. So it was people like Owen and Wright, like Skidmore, we talked about before, Thomas Skidmore, who are here in New York City creating, again, New York as a labor town, as a town that has room for radical ideas at the same time as it has room for the growth of extraordinary entrepreneurial capitalism in Wall Street. All of that is coexisting, and often cheek to jowl. We're talking about, just a few blocks away from one another. Eventually, shortly after that, her sister becomes ill, and her marriage takes her to Paris, and she leaves. She ultimately moves to Cincinnati years later. The point mostly is that she spends the time in New York, lays the groundwork, and is part of the political ferment that has led to a whole group of reform movements that we've been talking about. But one that it encourages in particular, through the Neshoba experiment, is the abolitionist movement that takes root in New York City. It's associated with a group of individuals that are also prominent in New York City social history, and in some sense, to the extent to which abolitionism is a political movement, the social politics of the city. William Lloyd Garrison and Arthur Tappan are two of these figures. Tappan is T-A-P-P-E-N, like in the Tappan Zee Bridge, right? You know the names. Garrison. They co-found in 1833, again, remember the dates, the same damn years we've been talking about. All this stuff happening at once. Okay? And it's happening at once and creating anxieties at the same time. One creates anxieties about the other, and anxieties about race become anxieties about class, and they become anxieties about gender. And they are all fueling one another. They form, in 1833, the American Anti-Slavery Society. It's founded in Philadelphia, quickly moves to New York. Tappan is its president. His name is Arthur Tappan. He has another brother, Lewis Tappan, we'll talk about in a minute, because his brother joins. They establish branches in New York City. So who are these guys, Arthur and Lewis Tappan? Well, they're two of three prominent brothers who make their way in New York City. The third brother is Benjamin, and he becomes a U.S. Senator, so he's not so undistinguished himself. Lewis and Arthur, however, lead the New York anti-abolitionist movement. They're born in Northampton, Massachusetts in 1786. A lot of very prominent reformers come out of New England and come to New York City. In 1826, they establish a silk business in New York City, and they become filthy rich. Okay? We're not talking, in other words, about poor people wanting to help other poor people. These are wealthy people who wanted to help poor people. However, they lose all their money in 1837 in the Panic of 1837. And instead set up a new business in 1841 called the Mercantile Agency. That organization, the Mercantile Agency, you now know better as Dun & Bradstreet. So these are a couple of guys who do rather well. Anybody know Dun & Bradstreet? That's the major rating organization of bonds, stocks in New York City on Wall Street. So these are people who are very prominent financiers in New York City. We're not talking about local yokels. Okay, these are big-time guys who make it. And they are as respectable as one can be. They read William Wilberforce, a British abolitionist who wrote an incredibly important pamphlet that led to the abolition of slavery in England and the abolition of slavery in the British West Indies, and they become converted to abolitionism. I didn't give you the name of the pamphlet, and I don't have the name of it right with me, but it's Wilberforce. Anybody, do you remember Wilberforce's pamphlet's name, anyone? No. Google, you'll find it.
Okay.
I should know it. The Tappan brothers, these guys, by the way, are also wealthy but quite radical at the same time. It's the kind of what we might call the contradictions of capitalism. They are not anti-capitalist. They believe in it very strongly. They are not people who are supporting socialism like Owenite, but they do advocate intermarriage. They are racial radicals. They advocate the intermarriage of the races, Lewis in particular, and argues that America should become a copper-skinned country, that the freedom of America and America's future lies in a society in which race would not define who anyone is. We have such a society today. I think we call it Hawaii, but that's about it. That's the closest we come to it, probably. They create many anti-abolitionist societies, and they're popular. But as I've suggested, even with their respectability and popularity, they become the focus of a great deal of hostility. The homes that they live in, the churches they're associated with, are constantly attacked, threatened, and occasionally burnt, vandalized. The most famous case of an attack on them is the anti-abolitionist riot of 1834. There are 3 riots that year. We talked about the Stonecutters riot. We will be talking next time, we're being reminded that there is also a political riot that takes place that year over an election. It's the Election Day riot that takes place. That has to do in part with the concerns by Republicans and Democrats, or Whigs, in this case it's Republicans and Democrats, about whether the election was going to be fraudulent in the 6th Ward. You saw hints of that in the film last time. Tammany Hall went out of its way to try to make sure that its voters would vote. Sometimes it liked to make sure that its voters voted more than once, or sometimes its dead voters voted. The Republicans wanted to do the same thing. Control of the ballot boxes was crucial. It was tied up with jobs. If you won jobs in this new Central Park, or building the aqueduct, or cleaning the streets. So it mattered to the social classes that were also had an ethnic character. That's that riot. This is the 3rd one, and it's the anti-abolitionist riot. Remember, I told you that the National Guard is called out 3 times. It's the year of the riots. The anti-abolitionist riot is sometimes also known as the Farren riots, F-A-R-R-E-N, and you'll hear why in a minute, because of some people called Farren. It occurs over 4 nights in July of 1834. Recall that's at exactly the same time that the General Trades Council is organizing. With, remember, that preamble that it wrote, that radical preamble about the widening of distinctions between some people in vassalage and some people who are in positions of supremacy. So you've got that occurring as a backdrop. The origins are that Arthur and Lewis Tappan and other leading New York City abolitionists had intensified their campaign against slavery and with the idea of colonizing African Americans in Africa. They had founded something called the Female Anti-Slavery Society. So they were not just founding more and more societies, they were also giving females a public role. That was also making people unhappy. Women on the streets, respectable women on the streets. How respectable, after all, can you be if you're on the streets as a woman? Tappan then makes a public statement of the humanity of African Americans, and he does that by inviting an abolitionist clergyman to his pew at what was the church that, at his own pew at the Late Street Church. Late Street was L-A-I-G-H-T in New York, the Late Street Church. The key is only that the parishioners were not thrilled because they're being chastised as being intolerant. They're being told that they should be tolerant towards slaves. People did not want to hear that message in church. The anti-abolitionists, in support sometimes of pro-colonization people who don't want people to be freed here, they want them to be expelled, begin to work together and circulate rumors that abolitionists are promoting interracial marriage. And indeed, if you recall, some had. Okay? Fanny Wright, in her own way, had done so, but in particular, Lewis Tappan had promoted intermarriage. But they're now arguing that everybody's now promoting it, and that prima facie by itself was thought to be an immoral position. So they start to circulate those rumors, those ideas, and argue everyone's going to be forced to marry, and you're going to have people living next door to you who are going to be dangerous people. An interracial group is organized to meet at one of the churches, the Chatham Street Chapel, to commemorate New York's Emancipation Day. meaning July 4th, 27, remember 1827, so now we're talking about July 4th, 1834. And an angry mob breaks up the meeting. So the beginning of this event is July 4th. That July 4th keeps coming back, only now it's 1834, at the Chatham Street Chapel, because they're celebrating emancipation and arguing it should be for black slaves as well. The emancipationists are physically attacked by members of the New York Sacred Music Society, who claimed they had prior use to the chapel, but obviously were anti-abolitionists. The police arrive and arrest 6 of the African Americans who were there, and then a large white mob forms, which force everyone to flee. Riots break out. And for the next 4 nights, there are riots. Okay. Now, the riots are stimulated even further by conflict in another building worth noting, because it again suggests the extent to which this is not just a political conflict, it is a cultural conflict. Cultural in the ways we've talked about class and ethnicity and attitudes about immigrants, papists and Romanists percolating through the city. George P. Farren, remember I said it's called the Farren Riots, was an English-born stage manager of the Bowery Theater and an abolitionist. And he is reported by anti-abolitionists to make some anti-American remark. We don't know that he really made it, or what it was, or why he made it. Supposedly the remark was, "Damn the Yankees, they're a damn set of jackasses and fit to be gulled." What was clear is that he was English-born, that he was seen as an Englishman making anti-American attacks, arguing that the Americans were the racists. The English, after all, had come to their senses through the Wilberforce pamphlet and had abolished slavery. Americans, the Yankees, were the jackasses, clinging to these attitudes. He also then fired quote, an American actor, an American-born actor. The anti-abolitionists post handbills denouncing Farren, and a mob begins to gather. What we have is effectively, in other words, a precursor to what some of you will know when you're reading of the Astor Place riot, in which immigrants, English and Americans, are in conflict with one another about what it means to be loyal and patriotic, and over the control of cultural spaces, social spaces. A mob gathers. Again, a mob is whoever you don't like. It doesn't mean they don't self-describe themselves as a mob. A crowd of angry anti-abolitionists gathers. They target the homes, businesses, churches associated with all abolitionists. 7 churches are burned. 11 homes are damaged, especially those belonging to African Americans. The Lake Street Church is one of those that's attacked. The Chatham Street Chapel is attacked. Lewis Tappan's home is attacked. 4,000 rioters attacked the Bowery Theater, where there was a benefit supposedly being held on behalf of Farren. The protest is only quelled not by the National Guard itself, but when Farren agrees to raise the American flag at his theater. And when they have a blackface performer whose name is, and I don't make this up, George Washington Dixon, perform Yankee Doodle Dandy, and then sing the minstrel song, the Zip Coon. That's to say, only by playing into the hands of black racism, mixed with a supposedly what we would call a veneer of patriotism, does the riot come to an end. The mayor addresses the crowd and they disperse. Now, it should be noted that one historian who has studied this actually argues that the working class protesters who were also opposed to abolitionist elites were as much opposed not just to their support of cheap white labor, but they were also opposed to what they believed to be the smutty tastes of these elites in these theaters, that these elites themselves were also involved in the articulation of cultural values that were suspect. This historian argues in a 1997 book, the book is called The Demons of Disorder. He says he sees that the riots were, quote, were about control of public discourse and community values with class at base the issue. And that, it seems to me, becomes the increasing key to the transformation in the debate about abolitionism that I want to conclude with today's lecture. Tappan's career continues. It's worth noting he founds Oberlin College, some of you will know, as an abolitionist college in the United States. And we know that a good deal of the Freedom Trail passes through places like Oberlin College. It become quite important. You'll see, even if those of you who come with me on Saturday will see some of that Freedom Trail through Brooklyn Heights, and we'll see some of the traces of the abolitionist movement in Brooklyn, which becomes a core for one of the major abolitionist preachers we'll talk about. Tappan ultimately resigns from the American Anti-Slavery Society in opposition to Garrison, with whom he'd helped found it. Why? Because of gender issues. Garrison had been influenced by Susan Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott to support women's rights. And increasingly, abolitionists, many of them in particular, like the Tappans, were hostile to women's rights. They were supporting black rights. The abolitionists divide over that. And in fact, the abolitionist movement increasingly in the 40s becomes a religious-based movement, not a social-based movement. It is a moral campaign. It is against the moral degradation of people as slaves. It is not about the social issue of inequality, which could extend to women and labor. So in fact, the people in support of this now divide, in which abolitionists in large numbers focus on freeing blacks, but are not willing to support the equality of women or freedom for labor, or support for labor. They form instead the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, and they support efforts to Christianize blacks in missionary societies, in particular after 1846. The most famous, however, of New York abolitionists I want to finish the story with, and you'll see something of his history in Brooklyn. The most famous of all New York abolitionists, Henry Beecher. Because his history briefly gives a sense of the contradictions, the struggles, and the achievements of the New York abolitionist struggle, as well as their complicated relationship to those in New York who didn't support their cause, especially the working class. Beecher again came from New England, Litchfield, Connecticut. He's the son of Lyman Beecher, a prominent abolitionist and Congregationalist minister, and he's the seventh of 13 children, including his sister, who some of you know, Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. He's raised as an Orthodox ministry. He prayed morning, noon, and night, and discouraged. He was a very serious man. He discouraged frivolity. He preached all the time about moral, upright behavior. Important part of this story. In 1847, he's appointed the first minister of the new Plymouth Congregational Church in Brooklyn. Not technically New York City history, right, at that point. Brooklyn, but we'll allow it. It is the New York City suburb being formed. He is an eloquent preacher, probably one of the most famous and most eloquent of America's preachers. He gives famed lectures. People show up wherever he speaks. He edits religious magazines. He gets audiences all the time, writes a prominent biography of Jesus. And people from Manhattan weekly take the ferry to Brooklyn in order to hear him preach. He advocates for women's suffrage, for temperance, for Darwin's theory of evolution. He's a foe of slavery and bigotry of all kinds, seemingly. And in the 70s and 80s and all kinds, though, he helps to delay the passage of the Chinese, and he also helps to delay the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which does happen in 1882. So he's fighting again, even to make sure that Chinese are not excluded from America. He raises money to oppose slavery in Kansas and Nebraska. His rifles become known as Beecher Bibles. The rifles. Supports the Free Spoil Party and later the Republicans. That is important. He holds mock elections in Brooklyn of slaves to raise money so his congregation can supposedly free them in his own way. He's doing what the Nasoba community tried to do in Brooklyn. And his story ends, however, with a famed trial called the Beecher-Tilden Affair, which ends his which marks his career, but also exposes the contradictions in his positions. He's charged with adultery with a friend's wife named Elizabeth Tilden. Now remember, this was a guy who spent his whole time talking about how moral everyone had to be and preaching the straight and narrow. So he's charged with adultery with his friend's wife. Her husband loses his job from the scandal, and Beecher convinces Elizabeth to recant that she'd ever had this relationship, which she does in writing. She says, "We never had a relationship." And there's a trial, and Beecher is innocent, or there will be a trial. However, Theodore Tilden, that's to say the husband, mentions the wife's confession, because the wife had confessed that she'd actually had the affair. She recants the confession. But he confesses the affair to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who mentions it to Victoria Woodhull, and then to Isabella Beecher Hooker, who is a cousin, who are all leaders of women's rights. Now you need to know that Beecher, as part of his sense of propriety, had supported women's rights, but denounced free love, but was involved in this adulterous affair that he was denying. So Woodhull decides to go public and to out Beecher as a hypocrite, and she publicizes the affair, which is a natural sensation. Beecher saying it didn't occur. She's saying there's proof it did occur, and he's a hypocrite. That's when the trial emerges. The trial in 1875, it ends with a hung jury because she has publicly recounted in this sworn statement. And there's a second trial at the church, and it exonerates him. What we need to know, or what you were worth noting, is that Elizabeth later confesses of the affair, and she's excommunicated. Beecher remains popular. But we know that he has the affair. He remains firm in denying it all the time. The woman with whom he has the affair and her husband lose his jobs, lose their respectability. They're excommunicated. Beecher remains above the whole affair and is effectively whitewashed. What does this finally tell us in conclusion? Well, the social conditions of African Americans in New York are not effectively changed by political emancipation. They always remain only about 1% of the city. And in fact, small numbers of them actually decline. Freedom does not make New York a beacon. And the ones that remain, we know, live in 5 points in the worst areas, what was called the Negro Plantation, an area that was marked off. They effectively become what we would now call, and it's a term we use with some reservations, ghettoized, in the sense that they become confined into this slum area, the worst areas, stigmatized in which they're there. So worth noting in the context of black poverty is that the concerns of abolitionism sometimes extended to women, but they focused on black legal rights and on the freedom, and this was the Free Soil Party and the Republican Party, the freedom to become free labor. And in that sense, it's worth noting that Beecher's views always reflected his class prejudice and those of the positions of elites. His liberalism, his liberality, did not extend to the working class. During the first national railroad strike that affects the United States, including New York in 1877, Beecher preaches against all the strikers whose wages were cut to starvation levels, and gives one of his most famous speech, with which I'll end. It was called the Bread and Water Sermon. He argued, and I quote, "Man cannot live by bread alone, but the man who cannot live on bread and water is not fit to live." The next Sunday he preached, "If indeed you are being reduced," he said, "go down boldly into poverty." Then, as one historian noted, he promptly left for a 2-week vacation in Europe.